had been planning a solo camping trip for weeks. It wasn't anything big or far away, just a couple of days out in a state forest that was only about an hour's drive from my apartment. I wanted to disconnect for a while, spend some time hiking, and just enjoy being alone. I had been camping plenty of times before, but usually with friends. This time I wanted to try it on my own, and the idea of it gave me a weird mix of excitement and unease. I drove up early in the morning and parked at a small gravel pull-off near a trailhead. The lot was almost empty, which I liked because I didn't want to deal with crowds. The weather was perfect, cool air with a light breeze, a bright sky without too many clouds. I strapped on my backpack, checked my water bottles, tightened the straps, and started the hike in. The trail wound through tall trees, mostly pines mixed with some hardwoods. The ground was covered in fallen needles and leaves, and every step I took crunched softly beneath my boots. For the first hour or so, I felt completely at peace. Birds called out from the branches, squirrels ran across the path, and I didn't see another person. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. That's always been one of the strange things about hiking. Sometimes the silence feels comforting, and other times it feels like the woods are holding their breath. I had marked a spot on the map where I planned to set up camp, a small clearing not too far from a creek. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. The clearing wasn't huge, but it was flat and had enough space for my tent. I dropped my pack and started setting things up. Tent first, then the sleeping bag and pad, then I gathered some wood for a small fire. I always liked the routine of it. It kept my mind steady. When the sun started sinking behind the trees, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. Just some instant noodles and a granola bar, nothing fancy. I sat by the fire and ate slowly, watching the flames twist and spark. Once it got dark, the forest changed. The breeze died down, the air cooled quickly, and every sound carried further. I could hear the creek faintly in the distance, and occasionally the snap of a branch somewhere out there in the dark. It was only my first night, but I already felt the weight of being alone. Normally with friends, there's laughter and talking that fills the empty space. This time it was just me, the fire, and the woods pressing in from all sides. I tried not to let my mind wander too much. I put out the fire before turning in, making sure everything was safe. Crawling into my tent, I zipped the door shut and lay down, listening to the sounds outside. At first it was normal nighttime noise, crickets, frogs, a few owls. But as I started to drift towards sleep, I heard something different. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A crunch of footsteps on the ground. Slow, measured. Not an animal scurrying, not a deer bounding, but something heavier, something deliberate. My body stiffened, and I lay still, holding my breath. The steps didn't last long. Just a few crunches, then silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even just a branch falling, though deep down I knew the difference. My tent wasn't big, and the fabric walls made me feel both hidden and exposed at the same time. I didn't move for a long while. Eventually, exhaustion forced my eyes closed, though my sleep was shallow and restless. The next morning, I crawled out of the tent and stretched. The forest was back to its peaceful self. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see something out of place. There were no clear footprints, at least none I could identify in the pine needles. I told myself I had overreacted, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. The day passed slowly. I went on a short hike to the creek, filtered some water, and spent time just sitting under the trees. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about those footsteps. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt uneasy in a way I hadn't before. Every time the wind rustled the branches, I'd tense up. Every time a stick cracked somewhere behind me, I'd glance around. I didn't see anyone though, and that was somehow worse. By the time evening came again, I had made up my mind to leave the next morning instead of staying the 2 nights I'd planned. I didn't feel comfortable anymore. Still, I went through the motions. Fire, food, sitting in the dark watching the flames. When I finally put it out and climbed into my tent, I tried to convince myself everything was fine. I had barely shut my eyes when I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, not far off at all. This time they went on longer. I could hear them circling, moving around the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. I stayed frozen, lying flat, barely breathing. I thought about unzipping the tent, shining my flashlight, but fear held me still. Minutes dragged by. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I was gripping the handle of my pocket knife inside my sleeping bag, though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone wanted to cause trouble. At one point, I swore I heard the sound of breathing just outside the tent. Then nothing. Silence. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe hours, maybe minutes. My whole body was tense, waiting, listening. Somehow, at some point, I must have drifted off despite the fear. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The clearing looked the same as before, but I noticed something that made my stomach turn. In the dirt near the fire pit, there were footprints. Human. They weren't mine. They were fresher, pressed deeper, circling the tent. That was all I needed. I packed up everything in record time, stuffing my gear haphazardly into my bag. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt twice as long. Every sound in the woods made me flinch, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting someone to be following. When I finally reached my car, I threw the pack in the back and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. Driving away, I felt a heavy relief, but also a lingering chill that wouldn't leave. I never saw anyone out there. I never knew who it was or why they were walking around my camp at night. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw in the dirt. Someone had been there, watching, moving slowly, circling while I lay in that tent. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I remember one year at camp, sitting under the weight of a heavy night sky, how a story burrowed itself deep into my mind and never left. The air was cool, with that mix of smoke and damp pine needles that clung to your clothes after hours around a fire. The camp counselor, an older man with rough hands and a weathered face, leaned forward and told us something that wasn't like the usual campfire tales meant to make kids squeal and laugh nervously. This one was darker, more grounded, and felt too real to be ignored. I can still remember the way the fire popped and cracked as he began, each spark lifting into the dark woods behind him like tiny ghosts of flame. He said it started with a body found deep in the woods. A large man, broad and heavy, was discovered not too far from a narrow trail that didn't get much use. His death wasn't drawn out, not from what anyone could tell. It looked quick, efficient, but the strange part wasn't the way he died. What stuck with everyone who saw the report was what was missing from him. 3 fingers from his left hand, the pointer, the ring, and the pinky were gone, cut clean off at the middle. No one could find them anywhere nearby. They searched the brush, the soil, even the animal tracks that wove in and out of that place, but the fingers were gone, like they had been taken. At first, it might have been written off as something wild, an animal maybe chewing at the body after death. But the cuts were too clean, too deliberate. They weren't torn or chewed. They were sliced. There was no sign of hesitation. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. No weapon was ever found, no footprints clear enough to follow. The police treated it as a homicide, but without much to work with, the case turned cold quickly. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was another man, a little smaller than the first. He was discovered farther into the woods, his body left in the same sort of condition. The same fingers missing from the same hand. Clean cuts again. Nothing else strange at the scene. No carving into the skin. No strange marks on the ground. No belongings taken. Just death and absence. People in the nearby town began whispering about it. Stories traveled faster than facts. Parents kept kids inside. Hikers avoided the trails. And the woods felt heavier with silence, as if the trees themselves knew something had moved in among them. Then came the third body. This time, it wasn't a man but a woman. She was smaller than the second victim, more frail. The same pattern though, killed fast, the same fingers removed, the same lack of evidence. Each case felt like a carbon copy of the last, except for one detail that seemed to creep closer to something unsettling. Each victim was smaller than the last, as though whoever was doing this was working their way down in size. First a big man, then a smaller man, then a woman. No one could figure out what that meant, but people began to notice the pattern, and it unsettled them in a way that rumors alone couldn't explain. Weeks passed, and the fear only deepened. More bodies turned up. Each time, the victims were smaller and smaller. A woman shorter than the last, then a boy, a teenager, then younger still, until children were among those found in the dirt and leaves. The killings weren't rushed. They weren't sloppy. They were precise and deliberate. That was what made them terrifying. It wasn't rage or passion. It was someone who had a goal, someone who was collecting something. One body stood out from the rest. It was a teenager around the age of 15 or 16. When they found him, it wasn't quite the same. Only 2 fingers had been removed from his left hand this time. The ring finger and the pinky. His pointer finger was left mangled but still attached. That detail stood out to investigators, though they didn't share much of their reasoning at the time. What pushed it further into the realm of horror was what they found on the scene. For the first time, a trace of the killer was discovered. A single fingerprint pressed faintly into something left behind, matched to prints in the system. But it wasn't from the killer, it belonged to the victim himself. That was when people realized what was happening. The killer was harvesting. The pattern wasn't random, and it wasn't ritualistic in the sense of strange symbols or superstition. It was practical. The killer had been searching for fingers that matched his own missing ones. Victims weren't chosen by chance, they were measured against a need. Each kill was an attempt to find replacements, to complete something broken. The counselor paused at this point in the story, and I remember the silence that fell across us. The firelight flickered across his face, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, his hand resting close to his knee. Then he said something that made the story settle deep into my chest, something I couldn't shake. He explained that the first victim was large, and his fingers would have been too thick. The killer took them, tested them, but they didn't fit. The second man was smaller, closer to what he wanted, but still not right. The woman came next, her fingers thinner, more delicate, closer still. Each victim was a trial, an attempt at finding the right replacement. And as the killings went on, the bodies got smaller because the killer was adjusting, narrowing in on the right fit. The teenager's hand had been close, but not perfect. Only 2 fingers were taken that time because those were the only 2 the killer thought would work. By then, the idea of what was happening was clear. Someone was replacing what they had lost, piece by piece, taking from others until the match was perfect. The missing fingers weren't trophies, they were parts meant to be used. And the worst part was that the killer had not yet found what he wanted. He was still out there, still searching, still trying again and again. The counselor shifted his seat, and the fire threw light across his hand as he pulled off one of his gloves. His left hand was scarred and rough, his pointer finger mangled and twisted, and his ring and pinky finger were gone at the halfway point. The skin was uneven, puckered with old wounds. He said nothing, just let the silence hang there, the firelight dancing across the ruined hand. Then he lunged forward suddenly, breaking the stillness with a guttural yell that sent half of us tumbling back in panic. My chest locked up tight, my throat dry as dust, and for a second it felt real, like the story had just ripped itself free from words and landed in the middle of us. But then he stopped, sat back, and let the moment dissolve. The story ended there, and the fire kept cracking, filling the space with its noise as we slowly caught our breath. Later, he explained that he had lost those fingers in a work accident years ago. His pointer had been saved but badly damaged, and his ring and pinky hadn't survived. He told the story every year, twisting it around his own hand, letting the scar itself become part of the legend. It wasn't until I was older that I thought more about it. How the story wasn't about ghosts or monsters or things in the dark. It was about something real, something possible. Someone with a need, someone broken in a way that drove them to take from others what they lacked. There was no supernatural element, no curse or myth, just a person and their obsession. And that's what made it so much worse. When I think back on that night, what stays with me isn't the counselor's lunge or the screams from the kids around me. It's the image of that scarred hand in the firelight, the reminder that people carry their damage in ways you can see and in ways you can't. And sometimes what they carry pushes them to do things you can't understand until it's too late. That story has never left me. It lives there in the back of my head, waiting, reminding me that the scariest things in the woods aren't shadows or animals or ghost stories whispered under the trees. It's people. People with a hunger that can't be filled, who will keep trying again and again until they get what they want. I remember one camping trip that stuck with me, not because of the usual things people talk about, the quiet of the woods, the comfort of a fire, or even the fear of animals, but because of a man I met there. His presence, the way he carried himself, and the things I noticed about him unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. It was one of those experiences that slowly burns its way into your memory until years later you can still feel the weight of it like it just happened. It was late summer, the air heavy with that mix of dry dirt and pine that clings to your skin after a few hours outside. I had chosen a smaller, more isolated campground, the kind with only a handful of sites scattered around a clearing. The kind of place you don't stumble into by accident, you have to choose it on purpose. That night, only 3 of the sites were occupied, and mine sat near the edge of the tree line. From where I was set up, I could just barely see the faint outlines of the other tents through the trees, their firelight flickering like dim lanterns in the dark. As I unpacked and got my fire going, I noticed him. He had chosen the spot farthest out, deeper into the trees, almost tucked away as if he wanted to disappear. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. He looked like any other camper, rough clothes, a beat-up pack, the kind of gear that looked like it had been used more years than I'd been alive. But when he came closer to the communal fire pit area, I saw his hand. His left hand was damaged, scarred badly, with 2 fingers gone halfway down and the pointer mangled in a way that twisted unnaturally when he moved it. He didn't hide it behind a glove or pocket like some might. He carried it in plain sight, and the more I looked, the more it seemed like he wanted people to notice. There was something about him, though not just the hand, but the way he held himself. He was tall, broad, not weak or frail despite the missing fingers. He had a presence that pressed against you like a heavy weight. He didn't laugh or talk much, at least not with the others. He mostly sat quiet, watching the fire, his face hard to read in the flickering light. I remember thinking he wasn't like the rest of us, who came out there for a break, for peace. He wasn't out there to enjoy the woods. He was there for something else. That night, I couldn't sleep easily. The air in the tent felt too still, and every sound outside, the cracking of twigs, the whisper of wind in the trees, seemed sharper than usual. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement near my site. It wasn't the heavy, careless steps of an animal. It was measured, careful, the kind of steps a person makes when they don't want to be noticed. I froze, barely breathing, straining my ears. The sound moved slowly along the edge of my tent, pausing every so often, and then faded into the woods. I lay there for a long time, my chest tight, before I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The next day, I saw him again. He sat alone at his camp, sharpening a long hunting knife on a stone, his scarred hand steady despite its damage. The sound of metal scraping echoed faintly through the trees. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anyone else, just kept at it with a kind of patience that unsettled me. It wasn't casual sharpening. It was deliberate, slow, like each stroke mattered. I remember watching the way the blade caught the light, how sharp it looked, how careful he was with it, and something about it made the hair rise on my arms. Later, when the sun went down, the air grew heavy again. Campfires burned low, and one by one people went to their tents. I sat awake longer than usual, restless. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, I stayed still but kept my eyes open. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw the faintest shadow moving, slow and deliberate, across the front. It wasn't close enough to touch, but close enough to see. The shape lingered there, tall and still, before moving away. My pulse hammered so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I didn't move. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. Morning came heavy, and I barely felt rested. I stepped out and noticed faint impressions in the dirt near my tent. Not boots, not clear prints, but the kind of scuff marks that told me someone had stood there, watching. I looked toward his camp, But he was gone, no sign of him. His tent still sat there, weathered and sagging, but the man himself had disappeared into the woods. Hours passed before he returned, carrying something wrapped in cloth that he tucked away in his pack. I never saw what it was. That night, I made the choice to keep my fire burning longer, not letting the dark close in so easily. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The woods felt alive, but not in the natural way. It was like every tree had eyes. Every shadow stretched a little too far. I sat there until exhaustion forced me back into my tent, the fire still smoldering outside. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a noise that froze me where I lay. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was breathing, heavy, slow breathing, just beyond the thin fabric. I could hear it close to the ground, steady in and out like someone crouched low, waiting. My throat tightened, and every muscle in my body locked. I didn't move, didn't shift, not even a finger. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever, then slowly drifted away, swallowed by the silence of the woods. When morning finally broke, my body ached from the tension of staying still so long. I stepped outside, and the marks in the dirt were clearer this time, kneeling imprints close to the tent. He had been there, right there, watching, breathing, close enough to touch the fabric. My stomach turned, and I packed my things as quickly as I could. I didn't care if it was early or if I looked paranoid. I needed to get out. As I loaded my gear, I glanced toward his camp one last time. He sat there again, at the edge of his fire, staring straight at me. His scarred hand rested on his knee, the mangled finger curled oddly, the missing ones clear in the light. His expression was blank, but his eyes followed me as I worked. He didn't move, didn't blink much, didn't look away, just watched. I finished packing, my heart pounding, and drove out of that campground without looking back. The whole way down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, that ruined hand in the firelight, his eyes fixed on me as if memorizing my every move. To this day, I don't know what his story really was. Maybe he was just a broken man who had seen too much and carried his scars openly. Maybe he wasn't dangerous at all, just strange. But the way he moved at night, the patience he showed, the deliberate steps, the crouching near my tent, that wasn't the behavior of someone harmless. That was commitment. That was intent. The scariest part wasn't his hand or his silence. It was the realization that whatever he was doing, he was willing to spend hours, nights, just waiting, just watching. There was a dedication in that, the kind of commitment that doesn't let go once it chooses something. I was lucky, I think. Lucky he never chose me for whatever it was he carried inside himself. Because I know, even now, if he had, he wouldn't have stopped until he finished. That trip left me with a lesson I've never forgotten. In the woods, it isn't the darkness or the animals or even the isolation that should scare you. It's the people who carry their damage in silence, who have the patience to wait, and the commitment to see things through. And once you've seen someone like that, you can't ever unsee it. You know they exist, and you know you could cross paths with one again. And that thought has followed me every time I've gone back into the woods. I remember one camping trip that has stayed with me more vividly than almost any other. It wasn't because of an animal encounter or a storm or getting lost. It was because of a story and the way the setting around me, dark woods, a glowing fire, the sound of night insects, made that story feel like it was pressing down on my chest with real weight. It was one of those nights where the world feels cut off, where your vision doesn't stretch beyond the reach of the flames, and every noise outside of that circle of light feels sharper and closer than it should. That was the night I heard about the fingers. It started like many campfire nights. We had hiked in earlier that afternoon, carrying everything on our backs, following a narrow trail that wound uphill through thick trees. The camp spot we chose was flat and wide enough to fit 3 tents, with a natural fire pit made of stones that had clearly been used by others before us. The ground was littered with pine needles and dead leaves, dry enough to crunch underfoot but damp enough to carry that earthy smell that never really leaves your clothes. We got a fire going quickly, using dry wood collected from the edges of camp, and soon enough the smoke was curling upward into the canopy, disappearing into the black. The firelight made everything just a little more eerie. You couldn't see far, only shifting shapes of trees swaying against the dark. Beyond that was nothing but blackness. When you've been staring at a fire for a while, your eyes lose the ability to adjust to what's behind you. So it always feels like something could be standing there, silent, just out of reach. It was in that atmosphere that the story came. It was about a man found dead in the woods. A big man, heavy-set, the kind of body that should have been hard to take down. But he had been killed quickly, efficiently. That wasn't the strangest part, though. What unsettled everyone who came across the body was that 3 of his fingers were missing. His pointer, his ring, and his pinky, all cut clean halfway down on his left hand. The cuts weren't ragged or torn. They were deliberate, made with a blade sharp enough to do the job clean. No one could find the fingers anywhere nearby, and no sign of struggle or fight was left behind. At first, people thought maybe it had been an animal, but it didn't fit. The body was left intact otherwise, and animals don't take only those exact parts and leave the rest. It was too precise. Investigators had no solid leads. The case lingered but went nowhere. Then, a few weeks later, another body turned up. This time, it was a man smaller than the first. Again, killed quickly, the same fingers missing from the same hand. Same clean cuts, same lack of clues. No blood trails, no discarded weapon, no tracks they could follow. It was as if someone had stepped in, done what they came to do, and vanished into the trees. Not long after, there was another. A woman this time, smaller still. The same injuries, the same story, kept happening. The victims grew smaller each time, as if the killer was working their way down, looking for something specific. Eventually, it wasn't just men and women anymore. Children began turning up in the woods, their bodies left in the same condition, the same fingers taken, nothing else touched. It wasn't rage, it wasn't robbery, it was something else entirely. People began to notice the pattern. The size of the victims was shrinking. First a large man, then a smaller man, then a woman, then children. The killings were deliberate attempts to find a match. Each time, the killer took those 3 fingers, tested them, and when they didn't work, tried again. It wasn't about the kill itself, it was about what came after. The story went deeper when one teenager's body was found. This time, it was different. Only 2 fingers were taken, the ring and the pinky. The pointer was still there, though mangled badly. For the first time, a piece of real evidence was found at the scene. A fingerprint. But when police ran it, it didn't belong to some stranger in the woods. It belonged to the dead teenager himself, linked to a record from a past theft charge. It was almost like the killer had been handling the hand, testing the fingers, pressing against the skin to measure them, and left the victim's own print behind by accident. That's when people started to understand. The killer wasn't taking trophies. He wasn't leaving signs of ritual. He was trying to replace what he had lost. He was searching for the right size, the right shape, trying again and again to find what fit. Each victim was an attempt, another test, another failure. And so he continued. As the story wound on, I couldn't shake the feeling of the firelight on my face and the shadows at my back. The woods, which had been so calm earlier, suddenly felt threatening. It wasn't animals you had to fear, or even getting lost. It was people. People with damage, people with obsessions, people who wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The most unsettling part was the idea of commitment. Whoever had been doing this, if the story was true, had gone to incredible lengths. He wasn't careless. He wasn't in a rush. He was patient. He was determined. The thought of someone out there, waiting, hunting, measuring hands and fingers in the dark, chilled me in a way I can't fully explain. It made every rustle in the brush, every twig snapping in the distance, sound like someone creeping closer, searching for a new fit. That night, when the story ended, I went back to my tent, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound was sharper. Every shift of the wind in the trees felt like footsteps. I lay there staring at the roof of the tent, the faint glow of the dying fire casting flickers across the fabric. I imagined someone outside, crouched low, watching, waiting to see if my hand might fit. Morning came eventually, heavy and gray, and nothing had happened. But the unease didn't leave. Packing up my gear, I felt exposed, like the woods themselves were hiding eyes that followed me. The trees looked taller, denser, and the air felt thicker as I walked out. Even after I got back home, the story didn't leave me. Years later, I still think about it. Not the glove being pulled off, not the final reveal of scars or missing fingers, but the idea behind it. The fact that somewhere, someone could have been so consumed by what they'd lost that they would search endlessly to replace it, no matter the cost. That level of focus, of obsession, is terrifying in a way no ghost story could ever be. It wasn't fantasy. It was rooted in the idea of real people doing real things in the real world. When I tell that story now around a fire, I can feel the same weight I felt that night. The woods close in, the flames dance, the shadows stretch long and sharp, and the silence after the story hangs heavier than anything else. I don't need to pull off a glove to make it land. The story itself is enough. It's awful, but it lingers, and it reminds you that the scariest thing you'll ever find out there isn't a ghost or a monster. It's a person who has decided you're the answer to their need. That's why I never forget it, and why I still feel a chill every time I step into the woods and zip myself into a tent. Because once you've heard about someone that committed, that patient, that cold, you realize it could happen anywhere. And if it did, there wouldn't be much you could do but hope you weren't the right size. I went camping one summer weekend with a couple of friends, the kind of trip where everyone talks big before heading out, but only a few actually carry their weight once we're in the woods. One of the guys, someone I'd known since school, was exactly the kind of person who would talk a lot before a trip but do nothing once it started. We had joked about it before, calling him lazy, but this trip showed me just how dangerous it can be when someone refuses to commit to their part. We picked a spot about a mile off an old dirt road. The trail in wasn't too bad, but it was long enough that carrying gear was work. I had a pack filled with food, water, and cooking gear, while another friend carried the tent. The lazy one had said he'd bring firewood and a lantern, but of course he showed up empty-handed, carrying just a sleeping bag and a half-full water bottle. He laughed it off, saying we'd find wood in the forest anyway, and that we didn't really need a lantern because the fire would be enough. I brushed it off at first, even though I felt annoyed. We reached the site mid-afternoon, set the tent up, and got a fire pit cleared. The air was heavy with the smell of damp pine and dirt, the kind that sticks to your clothes. I spent almost an hour gathering wood, sweating hard because most of what I found was still damp. The lazy one sat on a log, watching, occasionally kicking at the dirt like he was too tired from the short hike in. By the time I had enough wood to keep us going for a few hours, I was worn out. My shirt clung to my back, and my arms were scratched from pulling branches. Night came quick. The fire gave a weak glow, fighting the darkness, but the woods around us were thick. The light barely reached 10 feet out before it just died into blackness. Every crack of a branch out there made my head snap up. It's different when you're deep in the woods. Your brain gets sharp, picking up sounds you'd ignore anywhere else. Something as small as a squirrel skittering across the ground makes your chest tighten. We cooked some food, ate, and then just sat there in silence, staring into the flames. The lazy one stretched out, muttering about how he could just fall asleep right there by the fire. I kept thinking how he hadn't done a thing to help. Not with the wood, not with the fire, not with anything. It annoyed me more and more because when you're that far out, everyone needs to do their share. If something goes wrong, you can't count on anyone who won't work. Around midnight, the fire started dying down. I told myself I'd add more wood, but my body felt heavy. My muscles ached from hauling everything. I let the fire shrink down to a faint orange bed of coals, just enough to keep the bugs away. That's when I noticed how loud the woods had become. Crickets, frogs, some distant calls I couldn't place. They blended into one long hum. But every now and then, there'd be a break, like something big had stepped and the smaller creatures had gone silent for a second. My skin prickled each time. I glanced at the lazy one, stretched out and half asleep, his arms behind his head like he was sunbathing. He looked careless, completely detached from how serious it felt sitting in the dark. He had no idea how exposed we were, how thin the tent walls were, how weak the fire had gotten. He hadn't brought food, hadn't carried wood, hadn't thought ahead at all. If something came close, he'd be the last person to notice, let alone react. The night stretched on slow. Every hour felt longer than the last. My ears never stopped picking up noises from the treeline. At one point, I heard something bigger than a raccoon moving through the brush. The sound was steady, not the quick darting of small animals. Branches cracked, leaves shifted, then silence. I froze, barely breathing, my hand tight around the small hatchet I'd brought. The lazy one rolled over, still asleep, completely unaware. I kept my eyes locked on the dark tree line until I felt my jaw ache from clenching it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, forcing myself to stay awake while the fire died into cold ash. My back hurt, my legs felt numb, but I couldn't risk shutting my eyes. By dawn, I felt raw, like I'd been scraped from the inside out. The first gray light cut through the trees, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. That morning, we packed up. The lazy one complained about being sore from sleeping on the ground, as if he'd done the hard work. He didn't notice the tracks near camp, the kind of tracks that didn't belong to a deer or anything harmless. They were pressed deep in the soil, wide, with toes spread like something heavy had been standing there just beyond the reach of the firelight. I noticed them when I walked out to get water, and my stomach sank. Something had circled us while we were asleep. Something big. On the hike out, every sound in the forest made me twitch. My eyes kept scanning the shadows between trees. I couldn't shake the thought of how vulnerable we had been all night. I kept looking at the one who had done nothing, the one who had laughed off the responsibility of carrying wood, who had slept through the sounds outside the tent, who had no idea how close things had come. I realized then how dangerous it is to have someone like that with you in the woods. Not because of what they'll do, but because of what they won't do. By the time we reached the car, I felt drained, more tired than I'd ever been after any camping trip. I knew I wouldn't go out again with someone who couldn't carry their part. The woods demand more than that. Out there, laziness isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. I kept thinking about those tracks, about how close something had come to us, how close it had come to me while I sat there awake, staring into the dark. If I had slept like he did, if I had trusted him to do even a little, I don't think I'd be here telling this. That night taught me more than I wanted to know. Out in the woods, survival isn't about who tells the best stories before the trip. It's about who shows up when the dark closes in. And I'll never forget how it felt to sit in that firelight, realizing one of us was nothing but dead weight, while something circled just out of sight, waiting. I went on a camping trip once with a guy I knew mostly through work. He wasn't the kind of person you could forget. Everyone knew him as the guy who had lost a couple fingers in an accident years back. He turned it into part of his personality, joking about it whenever he could. His favorite was to hold up that hand and say he couldn't wave without people thinking he was flipping them off. New hires got a kick out of it until he would turn serious and warn them about safety, about being careful so they didn't end up like him. He was half comedian, half cautionary tale, and he seemed to enjoy being both. When we went camping, I expected more of the same. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A weekend in the woods, a fire, some food, a chance to get away from the noise of work. We hiked in with our gear, the air thick with pine and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. The day was warm, but the shade made it bearable. I carried most of the heavier stuff, and he walked ahead of me, swinging his pack like it weighed nothing. He kept talking about how nights in the woods always reminded him of old safety meetings at the job, how people would laugh until something bad actually happened. He laughed at his own words, that same dry laugh he always had. We picked a spot near a clearing where the trees opened just enough to let in the last of the sun. The ground was uneven but soft, covered with needles and moss. I dropped my pack and stretched, my shoulders aching. He set his stuff down and went straight to work clearing a fire pit. He joked about how missing fingers meant he couldn't play the guitar at camp, but he could still stack rocks. I smiled a little, but it was thin. I had heard most of his jokes before. As the sun sank, we got a fire going. The smoke curled up through the trees, sharp in the nose but comforting. The flames lit our small space, pushing the dark back just far enough to feel safe. We cooked some food, sat on logs, and listened to the woods come alive around us. Crickets chirped, something hooted in the distance, and the steady hum of insects filled the air. He poked at the fire with a stick, making sparks shoot up, and talked again about his accident. He always told it in a way that sounded like a warning but also like a performance. He liked the way people reacted. Out here, though, there was no one to impress but me. After a while, he went quiet. I noticed him staring at his hand in the firelight, the way the shadows stretched across the missing fingers. His face looked harder then, like the jokes had drained out of him. For the first time, it didn't feel like he was making light of it. It felt heavy, real, and close. I didn't say anything, but I could feel the shift. The fire popped and hissed, and he finally leaned back, laying flat on the ground, his arm over his face like he was blocking out the world. The night thickened, the fire burned lower, and the woods pressed in darker and darker. The air cooled fast, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Every sound outside the firelight felt sharper, like it was crawling right up my skin. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, but nothing showed itself. My eyes kept darting toward the shadows, trying to catch movement. He had dozed off, his breathing slow and uneven, and I was left staring into the dark. I added more wood, but it was damp and smoked heavy. The flames struggled, throwing weak light, and I realized how much the dark had swallowed around us. My ears picked up something heavier moving through the trees. It wasn't the quick scuttle of a rabbit or the light steps of a deer. It was slower, heavier, deliberate. I froze, gripping the handle of the hatchet I kept near me. My heart thumped in my chest, each beat loud in the silence between noises. I thought about waking him, but I didn't. He had always been the guy who turned everything into a joke, who laughed things off, who told stories about his hand like it was nothing. I didn't trust that he would take it seriously, not in the way I needed him to. I kept listening, my breath shallow, the sound in the trees coming closer, then fading, then closer again. I couldn't see a thing beyond the fire. It felt like whatever was out there knew exactly where the circle of light ended and stayed just beyond it. I didn't sleep at all. I sat up the whole night, every muscle tight, waiting for something to break the line and step into view. The fire sputtered down to red coals, and I kept feeding it just enough to hold the dark back a few more feet. He slept through all of it, shifting now and then, mumbling but never opening his eyes. I kept thinking about how he always warned people about safety, how he used himself as proof of what happens when you aren't careful. Yet here he was, completely unaware of what was moving just out of sight. By morning, the noise stopped. The first gray light touched the trees, and I finally felt my chest loosen. I stood up stiff and sore, my back screaming from sitting all night. He woke up yawning, stretching, like he'd had the best sleep in weeks. He looked at me and laughed, saying I looked like I hadn't slept a wink. I didn't even bother answering. I walked a little way out to get water from a stream, and that's when I saw it. In the soft dirt, just beyond where the firelight would have ended, were tracks. Big ones, too wide to be a deer, too heavy to be anything small. They were pressed deep into the soil, circling our camp like whatever it was had walked around us more than once. My stomach dropped. I stared at them for a long time, my mind running over the sounds from the night, the way I had felt watched for hours. He had been asleep the whole time, leaving me to sit alone with it. On the hike back out, he went right back to his old ways, joking, holding up his hand, making light of things. But I barely heard him. My eyes stayed on the trees, every crack and shift in the brush making me flinch. I kept thinking about those tracks, about how close something had come, and how I had been the only one awake to know it. When we finally reached the car, I felt a weight lift, but only just. I knew I'd carry that night with me for a long time. It wasn't just the sounds, or the tracks, or the feeling of being watched. It was the way I had realized that jokes and stories don't mean anything when the dark presses in. Out there, you either stay alert or you don't come back. And while he laughed about his hand and preached about safety, I learned what it really meant to sit in the dark, waiting, and to know that when it comes down to it, you're on your own. I worked as a camp counselor for a few summers, and those nights by the fire always stick with me. The kids loved the ghost stories, even if half of them pretended they didn't. They'd huddle close together, their faces glowing orange in the firelight, eyes wide, waiting for the next scare. I had my own story that I became known for. It wasn't anything too fancy, just one of those tales you could spin in a dozen ways. The gist was always the same. Some ghost or spirit would come for you unless you gave him 2 of your teeth and the names of 2 other people. The kids would laugh nervously, whispering about which names they'd give, but it was all in good fun. The part that made it memorable was the ending. I had a quirk most people didn't know about unless I showed them. When I lost all my baby teeth, 2 adult ones never grew in. For a few years, I had to wear a retainer with 2 fake teeth clipped into it, just to make my smile look normal. I figured out one night that if I slipped that retainer out right at the end of the story and grinned wide, it drove the kids over the edge. That gap, those 2 missing teeth, it made me look like the story had just bled into reality. The way their faces would go pale, the way they'd squeal and jump back. It worked every time. I used to get such a kick out of it. I'd wait until they were fully drawn in, leaning forward, holding their breath at the climax of the story. Then I'd pull out the retainer with a smooth little flick of my tongue, grin big, and show the missing teeth. The reaction was instant, a mix of shrieks, laughter, and kids running off into the dark. I'd watch them scatter back toward their tents, bumping into each other, tripping, still looking over their shoulders to see if I was coming after them. To them, it was harmless fun, but I always knew I was putting a little more fear into their heads than they bargained for. But there was one night that has stayed with me, and it wasn't because of the story itself. It was because of what happened after. It had been a long day at camp. We'd done the usual: hikes, swimming, crafts. By nightfall, everyone was tired, but campfires had a way of reviving the energy. The air was still heavy with smoke and the scent of pine. Sparks popped out of the fire and drifted upward, vanishing into the black. I was sitting on a log. The kids circled around, all staring at me as if I was about to give away some great secret. I went through the story the same way I always did, my voice low, drawing them in, stretching out the silences so they leaned closer. The idea of giving away 2 teeth and 2 names had them nervous but giggling, like they weren't sure if they should take it seriously. I dragged it on longer than usual, enjoying the way their eyes darted around at the shadows outside the firelight. When I finally got to the part where the ghost supposedly comes to collect, I popped the retainer out and flashed my gap-toothed grin. The reaction was bigger than usual. They screamed, some jumped up, a few even cried out. It was chaos for a moment. I laughed quietly to myself, feeling that little rush of pride at pulling it off again. But then I noticed something different. One of the younger kids didn't run. He just sat there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His mouth hung open a little, and his whole face looked frozen. It wasn't the normal shock and laughter look. It was something else. I brushed it off at first, assuming he was just more easily spooked. But later, when I was walking back to my cabin after lights out, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and scanned the dark. The woods were silent, the fire long out, and the camp quiet. But I swore I saw a shadow slip between 2 trees. It was quick, gone before I could focus. I told myself it was nothing, just one of the kids sneaking around. But the next morning, the director asked if I'd seen a camper wandering during the night. Some of the boys swore they had heard footsteps outside their tent, slow and steady, circling for a long time before fading away. They were too scared to look out, but they had all heard it. That put me on edge. I knew raccoons and deer could move through camp, but the way the kids described it made my stomach knot. Slow steps, circling, pausing. I tried to laugh it off with them, saying maybe it was one of the counselors checking on them, but deep down I wasn't convinced. That evening, when the sun set and the camp went quiet again, I kept catching myself looking into the tree-line. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, had me tightening my grip on the flashlight. I sat on my bunk that night, wide awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard it myself. Steps. Not heavy, not rushing. Just slow, deliberate steps. They crunched lightly in the dirt and needles, moving around the cabins. I froze, my body tense, barely breathing. The steps moved closer, circling, pausing now and then starting again. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the retainer in the other. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. When I finally worked up the nerve to turn on the light and shine it out the window, there was nothing. Just the still, dark woods. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I stumbled out, exhausted. I checked the ground around the cabin, expecting maybe tracks, but the soil was hard and dry. Nothing showed. The kids were restless too, some of them asking about the noises again, all looking more tired than usual. I never told them I heard it too. I couldn't bring myself to admit it. I had been the one making jokes, spinning stories, flashing my broken smile to scare them. But now I was the one sitting awake in the dark, too afraid to close my eyes. I realized then how thin the line was between a story you tell around a fire and the silence of the woods pressing in around you. By the end of that summer, I put the ghost story away. I never told it again. I stopped flashing the missing teeth at the kids, stopped trying to get that last big scare. Because no matter how many times I tried to shake it, I kept hearing those steps at night. Slow, steady, circling. And I knew I hadn't imagined it. The years since then haven't dulled it. I can still feel the way the air seemed heavier, the way the steps moved with patience, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I still don't know what it was, but I know one thing for sure. Scaring others is one thing, but when the fear comes back on you, when you're sitting in the dark and realize you're not the one in control anymore, that's when the real story begins. And I'll never forget that I was the one who started it with a smile. I always believed the best campfire stories weren't the ones everyone already knew. Ghosts, monsters, the hook-handed man, all those were overdone. The ones that really stuck, the ones that left people shaken, were the ones tied to something real, something unique, something you could touch or show. That's what made it sink in. A special prop, something no one else had, could turn a simple story into an experience that haunted people long after the fire burned out. I learned that lesson the hard way one summer. We were on a camping trip deep in the woods, far off any main road. It was the kind of place where the silence pressed down on you once the sun disappeared. Just the fire, the trees, and the noises that crawled out of the dark. I had a group with me, and like always, the fire ended up becoming the center of attention once night fell. We sat in a circle, the flames licking upward, sparks drifting into the night sky. Someone asked for a story, and all eyes turned to me. I had prepared something different. In my pack, I carried an old item that wasn't just a random thing, it was personal. A reminder of something that had actually happened to me years earlier. To anyone else, it probably looked like junk, but to me it was a piece of a night I could never fully shake. It was a small metal object, bent and scarred, nothing impressive until you knew what it was. That object had been in my possession since a camping trip I'd taken alone when I was younger. I'd been setting up a fire when I heard movement behind me. I turned too quickly, lost my footing, and fell hard into my own gear. I landed on a sharp piece of metal, part of an old rusted tool I'd packed without thinking. Cut deep, tore into my side. I'd managed to patch myself up with what I had, but the blood soaked through my shirt, and I had to stumble through the woods back to the car in the middle of the night, terrified I wouldn't make it. That bent piece of metal had stayed with me ever since. I kept it as a reminder of what one careless mistake in the woods could cost. That night, I used it as my prop. I told the story, left out the part about it being me, and made it sound like something that happened to someone else out here. I described the fire, the slip, the cut, the panic of stumbling through the woods bleeding in the dark, with the possibility of never finding the way out. The kids and adults around the fire leaned in, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. Then, when I reached the part where the blood wouldn't stop, I pulled the piece of metal out of my pocket and held it up in the firelight. The reaction was instant. Gasps, wide eyes, people shifting back. It wasn't just a story anymore. They could see it, could almost smell the rust and blood, could imagine how sharp it had been and what it had done. The weight of the object in my hand, the scars on its surface, made it real. That's what a good campfire story does. It makes people feel like the line between the story and their own night in the woods is razor thin. We laughed afterward, some trying to brush it off, others still shaken. Eventually, everyone drifted back toward their tents, leaving just the smoldering fire and the heavy dark around us. I should have felt proud. The story had landed. The prop had done its job, and I'd given them a night they'd remember. But as I sat there alone, staring at that bent piece of metal in my hand, the memory of my own accident crept back stronger than I expected. I could almost feel the pain again, the burning in my side, the stickiness of the blood soaking my shirt. I remembered the way the woods looked that night. Everything blurred, trees pressing in, shadows moving when I knew nothing was there. I remembered the sound of my own footsteps stumbling over roots and rocks, the cold air tearing at my lungs, the panic rising as the trail seemed to stretch forever. That metal wasn't just a prop. It was the reason I was alive. I had carried it out with me even as I bled, gripped tight in my fist without realizing it, like it was the only anchor keeping me from collapsing completely. Sitting by the fire, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It hit me then that I had brought that object back into the woods, back into the same setting where it had nearly cost me everything. And the woods didn't feel welcoming anymore. They felt like they were holding their breath, waiting. The fire popped loudly, and I flinched hard, clutching the metal so tight it dug into my palm. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside the tent felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, it all pushed my nerves higher. My mind wouldn't stop replaying that old night, the blood, the staggering steps, the fear that I wouldn't see another sunrise. I lay there staring at the nylon roof of the tent, listening to my heartbeat thudding in my ears. When morning finally came, I crawled out, sore and drained. The fire pit was just cold ash, and the woods were quiet again, too quiet. The others came out laughing, stretching, brushing it off like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I packed my gear faster than usual, and when I picked up the bent metal again, I realized my palm was red from gripping it too tightly in the night. On the hike out, I kept my eyes on the ground, scanning every root and rock, every dip in the dirt. I moved slower, more careful, like I was walking the trail for the first time again. That accident had been years ago, but the fear felt fresh. I knew if I fell, if I slipped, if I wasn't careful, the woods wouldn't care. Could happen again, and next time I might not make it out. By the time we reached the cars, the others were laughing about the story, still talking about the way I had held up the metal in the firelight. They thought it was just a trick, just a prop I'd chosen to make the tale better. I didn't tell them the truth. I didn't tell them that it was real, that it had cut me open, that it was why I couldn't walk through the woods without scanning every shadow, without keeping my hand close to my side. I never used it again. I left that bent piece of metal behind after that trip, tossed it deep into a trash bin, away from me for good. I realized it wasn't a prop. It wasn't a clever twist to scare kids at a fire. It was a scar I kept carrying back into the woods, and each time I did, it dragged the fear back with it. That night taught me something I'll never forget. The best campfire stories aren't just the ones with clever props. They're the ones that are real, the ones you've lived, the ones that remind you how quickly a simple night outdoors can turn into a fight for your life. And once you've lived through something like that, you don't need to make up monsters or ghosts. The woods themselves, the accidents waiting in the dark, the blood you might lose with no one around to help, that's more than enough to keep anyone awake at night. And that's why I don't tell that story anymore, because it wasn't just a story. It was me, and I don't ever want to feel that night creeping up on me again. When I think back on that camping trip, the strangest part wasn't the storms, or the exhaustion from hiking with a heavy pack for hours, or even the long nights in the woods where every sound seems sharper than it should be. What I remember most was waking up one morning and realizing someone else had slipped into our camp during the night. At first it felt almost harmless, almost like something innocent, but the longer I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. We had set out on a section of trail that wasn't particularly well traveled. It cut through dense forest, climbing ridges and dropping into valleys, always keeping us far away from the trailheads that day hikers preferred. The weather had been fine at the start. Clear skies, warm sun, that heavy green smell of damp pine and soil. My pack dug into my shoulders, but that was part of the rhythm of the trip. Step after step, Hour after hour, you forget the pain until it's just part of the background. That evening, after miles of climbing and slipping on loose rock, we found a spot just big enough for our tents. It was a flat patch of ground between thick trees, with enough space for us to spread out but close enough to feel like we were in one camp. We pitched our shelters as the light drained from the forest. The air grew cool, the sky darkened, and before long the only sounds were the crackle of our small fire and the insects buzzing in the brush. By 10 o'clock the sky opened up and the storm rolled in. The rain started as a light patter but quickly built into heavy drops that pounded the tents. Wind pushed through the trees, bending branches and making them creak above us. I lay in my tent listening to it, the sound of water hammering on nylon so loud it drowned out everything else. The ground turned soft beneath me. My pack shifted slightly against the wall of the tent where I had propped it. I shut my eyes, tired enough that even the storm couldn't keep me awake, and drifted into sleep. When I woke in the morning, the air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The forest steamed in the early light, drops of water falling heavy from every branch. I unzipped the tent flap, blinking against the pale sun. That's when I saw it. An extra tent. It was small, a low dome shelter, set just a few feet beyond the circle of ours. I sat frozen for a moment, trying to figure out if my memory was wrong, if somehow I had missed it the night before. But I knew I hadn't. The space had been empty when we went to sleep. We had chosen that clearing carefully because it had just enough room for us and nothing more. Yet now, somehow, this tent stood there, staked down tight, rainwater still dripping off the fly. I looked at the others. Nobody seemed to notice at first, busy crawling out of their shelters, stretching stiff legs, wiping condensation from the insides of their tents. Then, one by one, they saw it too. A stranger's tent in our camp. The flap opened after a while and a man stepped out. He looked tired but calm, like he had just finished any normal night of camping. He wore a rain jacket, hood pulled back, his hair damp from the storm. His movements were slow, ordinary. He didn't act nervous, didn't act strange. He looked like any other hiker who had set up camp for the night, and that's what unsettled me the most. He must have come in during the storm, when the rain was so heavy that none of us would have heard footsteps or the sound of stakes being driven into the ground. He must have worked quietly in the dark, moving around our camp while we slept only a few feet away, never making a noise loud enough to wake us. I imagined him slipping past my tent, his boots pressing into the soft ground, the light of a headlamp flashing briefly before being turned away. The thought made the back of my neck prickle. All day on the trail, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to tell myself it was innocent, that he was just another backpacker caught in the storm, desperate for shelter, who had stumbled across our group and decided to stick close for safety. And maybe that was all it was. But something about not hearing him arrive, not knowing he was there until morning, gnawed at me. That night, after another long day of climbing ridges slick with mud, we made camp again. The forest was darker here, the trees closer together, the ground soft from the rain. We set up quickly, ate in silence, and crawled into our shelters as the cold settled in. I tried not to think about it, but when I unzipped the flap later to let in a little cool air, I saw it again. His tent, just outside our circle, always nearby, never far away. It became a pattern. Each morning, I would open my eyes to see his tent pitched just beyond ours. Each night, no matter how far we had hiked, it would appear again. He never asked to join, never explained himself, never walked with us on the trail during the day. He was simply there, always near, always in sight. By the final morning, I felt worn down by it. My pack rubbed raw spots on my shoulders, my legs ached, but more than that, my nerves felt stretched thin. I wanted nothing more than to see the trailhead, to drop the weight off my back, to step into my truck and feel the doors close around me. When we finally reached the lot, the world felt different. Cars sat in neat rows, the sound of a highway carried faintly on the wind, the smell of asphalt and exhaust replacing pine and damp soil. We threw our packs down and stood there in the sun, sweat drying on our faces. I looked around, half expecting to see his tent one last time, tucked in a corner of the lot, the man standing nearby with the same calm face. But there was nothing. No tent, no trace of him at all. It was as if he had never been there. I know the simplest explanation is probably true. He was just another hiker who came in late, caught in the storm, and decided to stay close. Maybe he followed us because he didn't want to be out there alone. Maybe it was as innocent as that. But still, the part that lingers with me isn't his face or his tent. It's the thought of him moving around our camp in the pouring rain, unseen, unheard, while we lay there unaware. It's the thought of someone slipping into the small circle of safety we had built for ourselves in the middle of the wilderness, reminding me how fragile that circle really was. And that's what I carried home with me after the trip. Not the memory of the storm or the long miles, but the knowledge that even deep in the backcountry, when you think you're alone, you might not be. Sometimes someone else is already there, sitting quietly just outside your firelight, waiting for morning to come. I grew up spending a lot of time in the woods, and camping was second nature to me and my family. My parents were the kind of people who knew how to read clouds, how to find water in dry terrain, and how to handle themselves around wild animals. They had both grown up in the mountains and passed that love of the outdoors on to my brother and me. By the time I was old enough to hike on my own, I already knew how to set up a camp, how to recognize signs of predators, and how to stay calm when things got tense in the wilderness. That's why what happened on my parents' property in the Rockies all those years ago has never left me. We had plenty of strange moments while camping. Close encounters with bears, coyotes circling at night, the occasional odd noise you couldn't quite explain, but nothing ever compared to this one night. It's still the one story that comes up every time we sit down and talk about the old days. My parents owned about 35 acres tucked deep in the Rockies. It was a few hours from home, and we treated it like a second backyard. The place was secluded, quiet, and beautiful. No other cabins or homes nearby, no roads cutting through, just untouched woods, tall pines, and long stretches of mountain air. We'd pitch our tents, spend entire weekends there, and sometimes even whole weeks during the summer. My brother and I grew up running wild through those trees, catching grasshoppers, hiking ridges, and building forts out of dead branches. One particular trip started like so many others. We left late, later than usual, and by the time we reached the property, it was around 9 or 10 at night. The last stretch of road was a slow crawl up the mountainside, headlights bouncing off trees and rocks, the dark pressing in on all sides. By the time we pulled off and parked, everyone was tired. We just wanted to get the tents up and sleep. But the second we stepped out of the car, we all froze. It wasn't like running into a bear or mountain lion, where you can feel the weight of a predator's eyes. We'd all experienced that before. This was different. The air itself felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. It was the strangest sensation, like being watched, but not by one set of eyes. It felt like we were surrounded on every side. The woods, usually alive with noise at night, were silent. No insects buzzing, no owls calling, not even the faint hum of the forest that you normally stop noticing after a while. It was absolute stillness, and it was wrong. We laughed it off nervously, made a couple of jokes, and started setting up camp anyway. But even as we worked, that feeling never went away. The dogs stayed close to us, ears up, eyes darting. Then the noises started. At first, it sounded like branches shifting high above, maybe 10 feet off the ground. It reminded me of something heavy moving through the trees. Not the careful movements of a cat, not the flutter of birds, but something clumsy, big, and awkward. It started in one spot, then another, until it seemed like there were several of them all around us. The sounds weren't quiet either. It was snapping, crashing, the kind of weight that made branches give way. I remember trying to make sense of it. Maybe raccoons, I thought. Maybe a group of them fighting or scrambling through the trees. But raccoons didn't move like that, not in groups, and definitely not with that much force. Birds didn't either. It was like something else entirely, and my stomach twisted with each snap of a branch overhead. We hurried to finish the tent, and once it was up, my parents shoved my brother and me inside. They told us to stay put while they went out with their flashlights. I could hear them walking through the brush, calling softly to the dogs, the beams of their lights swinging across the fabric of the tent. That was when the calls began. It's hard to explain them. They weren't animal calls I recognized. They weren't the cries of coyotes, the hoots of owls, or the growls of bears. They weren't even close. These sounded almost human, like people trying to mimic primates, hollering back and forth across the trees. There was something about the pitch, the rhythm, the way one call would echo from one side of the woods and another would answer on the other side. It was too coordinated to be random, too strange to belong to any animal I knew. It sent chills through me even as a kid. The branches cracked louder, the calls came faster, and soon it felt like the whole forest was alive with movement and noise. My brother and I huddled together with the dogs, who had gone from barking to cowering, pressed low to the ground with their tails tucked. The tent fabric trembled as the sound outside swelled, like a storm breaking loose. Then my dad came back to the tent. He was calm, but I remember the look on his face, sharp, alert, every muscle tight. My mom came behind him, her flashlight beam darting across the trees. She was fearless in the outdoors, the type of woman who would stalk a bear just to get a good photograph. But her expression that night rattled me. She looked shaken in a way I had never seen before. We all stayed in the tent for a while, the four of us and the dogs pressed together, listening. The noise was everywhere, branches cracking, calls echoing, the sound of movement in every direction. It didn't fade or move away. It stayed all around us, constant and overwhelming. Then my dad unzipped the tent. The moment he did, it all stopped. The forest went silent again. No rustling, no calls, no breaking branches. Just quiet. The pressure in the air lifted like someone had opened a window. It was so sudden that it felt staged, as if whatever had been out there knew exactly what we were doing and decided to freeze. My parents stepped outside, their lights sweeping through the trees. My brother and I waited, holding our breath. After a long time, they came back. They said they didn't see anything, just some fallen branches and what looked like strange marks high up on the trunks of a few trees. Nothing solid, nothing that explained the chaos we just lived through. Somehow, we all managed to get a few hours of restless sleep after that, though every sound made me jolt awake. The next morning, the woods looked normal again. Birds sang. The air was light. The forest felt alive the way it should. It was as if the night before had been some kind of fever dream. We still talk about it to this day. None of us can explain it. My parents had decades of experience in the backcountry and had taught us how to recognize every sound and sign we might come across. But nothing from that night matched anything they knew. It wasn't a bear, a mountain lion, or any other predator. It wasn't raccoons or birds or coyotes. The closest description I can give is that it sounded like people we couldn't see, calling and crashing through the trees, surrounding us in the dark, and then disappearing without a trace. Out of all the strange things we saw and heard in those mountains over the years, that night stands apart, because there's still no answer, no way to make sense of it. Just the memory of oppressive silence, a storm of unrecognizable noise, and the uneasy truth that something out there watched us from all sides and then slipped away before we could ever understand what it was.